The Racing Point Formula 1 team will be renamed to Aston Martin for the 2021 season onwards, after having competed under Racing Point for just a couple of years. If you trawl through the team's history, you will see a raft of name changes that date all the way back to 1991. Then known as Jordan Grand Prix, it quickly became a popular team, and those cars are still missed to this day. I miss them. But while they experienced high points in the late 90s through to the early 2000s, it soon fell under that cloud where the team would require extra backing in order to help make ends meet. In their last season in 2005, they had two very interesting pay drivers in their seats. One of them was Thiago Monteiro. This was the man who scored Jordan's last ever podium at the oh-so-loved 2005 United States Grand Prix. But let's not talk about that anymore. Wait, hang on. We have to. But that guy's teammate was a curious case indeed. He was the first driver from his country to compete in Formula 1. His performances early in the season had turned heads, but would soon fade into obscurity. He won junior Formula titles, he won for his nation, and would later go on to test for teams such as Williams. He was a pioneer, from a country home to 1.5 billion people. And yet, if you say his name, most would just laugh. So, I guess the question here is, what happened to this guy? Narain Karthikeyan remains one of only two Formula 1 drivers to hail from India, and a lot of people primarily remember him for Vettel's cucumber comment. But aside from that, you'd be hard pressed to find a casual fan who is aware of what he's done behind the wheel. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. But for however many memes and jokes are around this guy, there is a little bit more to his career than you may think. Born in Coimbatore, India, Karthikeyan grew up in a sporting family. However, unlike most Indians who would normally pursue the national game of cricket, Karthikeyan's love was firmly with motorsport. He was introduced to the sport at a young age through his father, who was an Indian national rally champion and 7-time winner of South India Rally. He made his car racing debut in the Formula Maruti series before travelling to France to partake in the Pilota Elf competition in 1992. He competed once again in Formula Maruti in 1993 before heading over to the UK to compete in the British Formula Ford Championship. It was a relatively quiet season, finishing 13th in the standings, although he would achieve his first podium in the support race for the Portuguese Grand Prix at Estoril and would win the Winter Series to cap off the year. Heading back to Asia in the year after that, Karthikeyan competed part-time in the Formula Asia series, although the pace demonstrated in his time here was enough for him to consider a full-time season in 1996. And of course, he would go on to win the championship. So with this result, Karthikeyan moved back to the UK, hopeful that his experience would help guide him to the Formula Vauxhall title. Where it actually guided him was 6th place. However, he did win a race at Donington, so I guess it was that. Nonetheless, Karthikeyan would graduate to the British F3 series in 1998, driving with Intersport alongside Ben Collins and two other people that didn't get to play the stick. Initial efforts looked rubbish on paper, and by the 6th round at Donington, Karthikeyan was out of a drive. But then a place came available at Collin, which saw Karthikeyan return to the championship at Pembury, and when he returned, the results picked up with Karthikeyan securing podiums in the final 2 rounds at Spa and Silverstone. He would once again team up with Collin for the 1999 season, and this time, Karthikeyan would take 2 wins, both at Brands Hatch, and his efforts meant that he finished in 6th place overall, finishing ahead of the likes of Alex Young and, For 2000, Karthikeyan would move to Paul Stewart Racing for a 3rd attempt at the British F3 crown, but despite achieving 4 podiums that season, he had to settle for 4th place in the driver's standings, while teammate Thomas Scheckter achieved 2nd place overall. Not the greatest result, but he would compete in numerous one-off F3 races later that year. This included a campaign at the Macau Grand Prix. Karthikeyan took pole position ahead of Takuma Sato and led the race comfortably in the opening stages. Victory was certain. But then, Karthikeyan crashed on lap 6, taking him out of the race. It's something that he still rues to this day, acknowledging that he very well could have won that race and become India's first ever Grand Prix winner. Fun fact, that title now belongs to Jihan Daruvala for winning the New Zealand Grand Prix. And you know, for however much we take the piss out of him, he was showing some speed at this time of his career, you know? And he would prove that once again by winning the Korea Super Prix held in Changwon later that year. These performances gave him the moniker of being the fastest Indian in the world. But despite being a literal 1 in a billion in the eyes of the patriotic journal, Karthikeyan couldn't make that leap to Formula 1. At least, not yet. Instead, Karthikeyan packed his bags and headed for Japan to contest the Formula Nippon Series in 2001. Joining Team Impel, Karthikeyan was paired up with Satoshi Motoyama, which made things just a tad difficult, seeing as how this guy was only extremely fast. Karthikeyan also struggled to gel with the culture of Japan. He wasn't a fan of the food, and struggled with the language. And hey, to be fair, it doesn't matter how long you study the damn thing for. There will be days where you look at the wall of Japanese and think, no. While teammate Motoyama would go on to win the title, Karthikeyan finished a lowly 15th with only 2 points finishes to his name. But it wouldn't be all bad times for him in 2001, because in June that year, Karthikeyan headed to Silverstone to test with the Jaguar Formula 1 team, thus becoming the first Indian to drive a Formula 1 car. He also tested for Jordan in that same year. This was groundbreaking stuff, but ultimately, it still didn't lead to a full-time drive yet. However, with the goal in sight, Karthikeyan returned to Europe to compete in the World Series by Nissan Series. Team with Peter Sundberg at RC Motorsport, Karthikeyan had a troublesome middle part of the year, although he would finish ahead of teammate Sundberg and achieve the team's only podium at Harama, as well as its only pole position at Surtiba. He remained in the series for 2003, rejoining the Carlin team that he raced with early on in his career. This time, he would drive alongside Bruce Joigny. Karthikeyan finished 4th overall with 4 podiums to his name, while his teammate faltered. But it was during this season where Karthikeyan's Formula 1 dreams picked up again. Over at Minardi, Nicolas Kaiser had signed up to complete the last few races of the season, although it wasn't originally meant to be him. Apparently, Karthikeyan was in talks to take over the drive, although these plans fell through, and ultimately ended up testing for the team at the end of the year. Still though, this guy was getting closer and closer to his Formula 1 dream. But for 2004 at least, he would spend another year in the World Series. Having rejoined RC Motorsport, Karthikeyan would finish 6th in the standings, although he enjoyed a good year of results including a win at Manicourt and Valencia. Boy here was showing some speed even if the standings didn't necessarily reflect that. Helmut Marko saw this too, although it may have been out of his bad eye. Nevertheless, Karthikeyan was drafted into the Red Bull Junior team for the 2004 season. At the end of the year, he tested an IndyCar at the Phoenix International Raceway for Eddie Cheever Racing, and was offered a seat for next year's Indy 500. Although, he'd take a pass on this, because back in Europe, he had his sights set on something else. He had proven to have a degree of speed, but his backing was also of utmost importance. One team that needed a mixture of both was the Jordan Grand Prix team, who had just been bought by some Russians. However, these particular Russians didn't have any sons to drive for the team, and with Nick Heidfeld and Timo Glock leaving the team, 2 new drivers were required to fill the void. On the 1st of February 2005, in a press conference at the Taj Mahal Hotel in Mumbai, Karthikeyan was announced to become India's first ever Formula 1 driver for the forthcoming season. Now, with him being in a Jordan in 2005, he wasn't exactly expected to win any championships or anything, but he did have a teammate to go up against. In this case, it was Portuguese driver Tiago Monteiro. Not exactly a trailblazer, but he did beat Karthikeyan in the previous year of junior racing. So by the time they got to Melbourne for the first round, you would imagine that Karthikeyan would be a laughingstock, and would be severely outqualified and not even meet the 107% time, which we'll get back to later, in order to qualify. Instead, he stuck it on the 6th row of the grid, ahead of teammate Montero and the Lord of the Eyebrows. In fact, for the first 10 Grand Prix that year, Karthikeyan was actually beating Montero in the qualifying battle, with some sensational performances to start off the year. Not my words, the words of Martin Brundle. He would finish ahead of Montero in the first race in Melbourne, and again in Sepang. However, in the 3rd round in Bahrain, he would complete 2 laps before the electrics went on strike. But while the first few races were pretty decent for him, the remainder of the year was relatively crap. Some of it was down to him, and some down to the alleged politics within the team. And driving a Jordan, the likelihood for points was pretty much non-existent. That was until the United States Grand Prix, where there was a slight disturbance. And when I say slight disturbance, I mean that over half the cars would not take the start. And I guess now is when I have to lend some explainings to those who are not aware of what Formula 1 was like back in 2005. So, there was a tyre war back then. Some used Bridgestone rubber, while others used Michelin. The teams that used the Bridgestones were Ferrari, Minardi, and Jordan, and everyone else was on the Michelin tyres. Over the course of the weekend, the Michelin runners began to experience tyre failures. I'll explain this all in another video, because this really was the biggest farce on American soil since American Top Gear. or the Yankees. The point is that all Michelin-shod cars would be forced to withdraw from the race, leaving the Bridgestone runners, Ferrari, Jordan and Minardi, as the only cars on the grid. Aside from the ridiculous nature of what was unfolding, this was crucial because one of those teams was going to score the vital constructors points to keep them off the bottom of the table for the season, and one of those drivers was going to get their first ever podium. But which driver would it be? Would it be Karthikeyan, Montero, Christian Albers, or God forbid, Patrick Friesacker? Well, it wouldn't be him, and it wouldn't be Albers. And it wouldn't be Karthikeyan either, as Montero would be the only happy person in Indianapolis that day, taking his first and only podium in Formula 1, as well as Jordan's last ever podium. Nonetheless, Karthikeyan scored his first points and remains the only Indian to score points in a Formula 1 race.
Take that, Karun.
The rest of the year wasn't terribly great, apart from one good qualifying session at the season ender in Shanghai, where he out-qualified the Mel Gibson of the racing world, Jacques Villeneuve. And he celebrated this momentous occasion by destroying his car in the race, bringing his season to a disastrous end. His inclusion into the team for the 2006 season was eradicated, thanks to the team's new management demanding $11.7 million worth of sponsorship from Karthikeyan.
Bruh.
So instead, he went to Tesla Williams, where he was actually outpacing second driver and future world champion Nico Rosberg. He remained their test driver for 2006, right up until 2007, which is when his main sponsor, Tata, decided to stop lending money. He was also linked to Spiker for the 2007 season, after the team made the conscious decision of firing a driver mid-season. However, that set went to Sakon Yamamoto, who incidentally has a Wikipedia article that simply reads, meh. But while Karthikeyan with Tesla Williams in 06 and 07, he never truly liked the idea of being out on track without the fear of being lapped. So instead, he headed to New Zealand in late January to compete for Team India in the A1GP series. The A1GP series was pretty much the World Cup of motorsport. It was a fantastic idea that was doomed from the start. He drove most of the season with a best result of 4th at Brands Hatch. Meanwhile, back in Europe, Vijay Mallya, Kingfisher Tycoon and human form of Gravy and Biscuits had bought the Spiker team and announced its rebranding to Force India. Naturally, Karthikeyan was tied to drive for the team, but he wouldn't get so much as a test for them. He was also linked to Super Aguri, but of course, nothing came of this either, and alas, his Formula 1 career appeared to be all but over. At least for now. In the meantime, Karthikeyan would continue to compete for Team India in A1GP from 2007 to 2009, where he would rack up 1 pole position, 3 podiums, and 2 wins. He also partook in the 24 Hour of Le Mans, where he finished 7th overall, or at least that's what the results sheet said. But the story of his Le Mans venture was interesting. After putting in some good performances in the lead up to the race, Karthikeyan was meant to drive the opening portion of the race in a double stint. However, before the race started, he climbed over the pit wall to go take a shit, but in doing so, he sort of fell and dislocated his shoulder, which would force him out of the race and gave him an injury which would not fully recover for another 2 years. After A1GP collapsed, Karthikeyan sought refuge in the super weird Super League Formula Series in 2010, winning 1 race at Brands Hatch. As well as this, Karthikeyan decided to compete in a series of which the luxury and glamour of Formula 1 was rivaled. A series which requires at least a modicum of etiquette and is universally described as the ballet of the racing world. NASCAR. Competing in the truck series for Weiler Racing, he would put in some okay performances and would win the most popular driver award because, I mean, hey, why not? But all of this didn't satiate Karthikeyan's thirst. He wanted to get back into Formula 1. Problem was, there wasn't really a team he can go to, until Hispania Racing's drivers had ditched the team by the end of 2010 and left 2 vacancies at the Spanish team. One of those seats would be occupied by Vitantonio Liuzzi, who was very fast, but had a nasty habit of remembering mid-race that he was Italian. The second driver was announced on January 6, 2011, and of course, it was Karthikeyan. This was doubly important because 2011 would see the first running of the Indian Grand Prix. An Indian driving in the Indian Grand Prix. A dream come true. However, this season would be anything but a dream. There were 2 reasons for this. Firstly, Hispania Racing were the stragglers of Formula 1. The cars were garbage, and often had the performance and reliability of a McDonald's drive-thru. Then there was the second problem, and now is where I'm going to stop being nice to Narain.
Sorry bruv, I gotta lay down some truth here.
Narain was comprehensively beaten by Liuzzi for that season. It was even worse in Melbourne when both he and Liuzzi failed to qualify for the race. What's more, there were 2 occasions where Karthikeyan broke a record in Formula 1, but but it wasn't a record you'd be particularly pleased about. It was the record for the lowest place finisher of a Grand Prix, first breaking it in China when he finished 23rd, and then breaking it again in Valencia when he finished 24th. And while that had nothing to do with it, Karthikeyan was booted from HRT to make way for Red Bull Jr. Daniel Ricciardo from the British Grand Prix onwards. Although it was not the end for Narain, as he would return for his home race in India. With the home crowd on his side and looking to make an impact, Karthikeyan put in a lap time of 1:30.238. Which was slower than rookie teammate Ricciardo. And this would be further compounded when Karthikeyan was penalised for blocking Michael Schumacher in Q1. Although, hey, to his credit, Karthikeyan did beat Ricciardo in the race to finish 17th. Although this would be his last race for the year, and I guess despite being in the worst car in the grid, it was perhaps gratifying to beat his teammate in his last F1 race, right? Well, it wasn't his last F1 race, because on February 3rd, 2012, Karthikeyan announced that he would be driving once again for HRT, this time for the duration of the season, and would be partnered by Pedro de la Rosa for the season. And no disrespect to Pedro, but he was 111 million years old at the time of his signing. Having said that, Narain wasn't a spring chicken either, so the team rocked up to the Australian Grand Prix with a car that certainly looked better than in previous years. The problem was that it was still slow enough to gather algae. This became a problem in qualifying, as both cars would not qualify once again. Thus, de la Rosa and Karthikeyan would be forced to wait for the Malaysian Grand Prix just a couple weeks later. And hey, once he was there, he did qualify. I mean, barely. However, as both HRTs were starting at the back, they decided to gamble with the weather, starting Karthikeyan on the wet tyres, praying that the rain would get worse. And whatever god they prayed to, it worked, as everyone was forced to pit and help levitate Karthikeyan into the points. That was until the safety car came out due to the rain, and then subsequently the red flag. As the race got back underway, the track began to dry out ever so slightly. Cars began to pull in for intermediates, but Karthikeyan stayed out there on the wets, and was running as high as 5th place at one point. In an HRT! That was until he was hit on lap 15 by Jenson Button, giving Karthikeyan some damage to his car, and consequently forcing him into the pits. He changed to the intermediate tyres, which saw him drop to the end of the field. Sorry to take the wind out of your sails. But of course, that was not the end of his race. Not by a long shot. On lap 47, Sebastian Vettel came into the picture in his Red Bull and lapped Karthikeyan, and while doing so, clipped Karthikeyan's front wing, causing a puncture for Vettel and throwing him out of the points. The stewards meanwhile took note of Karthikeyan's involvement in the incident and rewarded him with a 20-second post-race penalty, dropping him to last place behind Old Man River. The fallout to the Vettel-Karthikeyan incident was extreme, with Vettel calling Karthikeyan an idiot and a cucumber, to which Karthikeyan responded by calling Vettel a crybaby. For the majority of the season, de la Rosa outqualified him and outraced him. It seemed that nothing was going his way, until the 2012 Belgian Grand Prix, after Romain Grosjean took out half the field in his bid to learn how to fly. Karthikeyan found himself in 13th after 30 laps, and had some good race pace on hand. That was until the suspension decided to nope on him and forced him out of the race. Good fortunes were just on the horizon though, when he managed to outqualify de la Rosa for the first time all year at Monza, and then again in Singapore. Unfortunately, on both occasions, he was beaten by de la Rosa in the Grand Prix, with Singapore ending on a particularly sour note after he crashed out on lap 30, which tested the patience levels of everyone working within the pit garage. He qualified last in Suzuka again, although he was running ahead of de la Rosa before his race was brought to an end due to vibrations within the car. The next couple of races in Korea and India were relatively unspectacular, as he would finish last in both races. He wouldn't finish last in Abu Dhabi, however, although that was because he didn't finish at all. This was because Nico Rosberg tried to lap Karthikeyan using the novel method of mounting Karthikeyan's HRT rather than just going around it. And that, kiddies, is how baby Formula 1 cars are made. Any questions? In Austin, Karthikeyan once again got in the way of Vettel, which eventually gave the lead to Lewis Hamilton. And then finally there was the last round in Brazil. This was a little bit more eventful, as the carnage at the start allowed Karthikeyan to run as high as 11th place. However, with the HRT being what it was, he was relegated to last once again when the other cars spinning at the start got their act together. He finished the season in last place with no points to his name, and by this time, Narain had enough of struggling in a car built by a team of people who throw goats off church towers. Although, to be honest, he didn't really help himself with some of his performances, you know what I mean? Of course, HRT would be no more come 2013, as they could no longer keep the team afloat. He attempted to find a midfield team willing to take him on, but with the finances of F1 spiraling out of control, he decided upon other ventures entirely, and conceded his Formula 1 career to be over. But not willing to relinquish his career in open wheelers, Karthikeyan went to the AutoGP series, which was starting to die a slow death. Nonetheless, it still played host to some modest talent, and had a field large enough to warrant calling it a championship. For the first 3 rounds, he struggled in a team that was making life difficult for him. On paper, the results looked as pathetic as you would expect. However, he would join Supernova Racing for the 3rd round in Silverstone, replacing Francesco Dracone. He would go on a manic streak of pole positions, podiums, and wins, allowing him to finish 4th in the standings. But now that he had an appetite for winning, Karthikeyan looked toward Japan for the 2014 season, driving in the Super Formula Series for Team Impel. Karthikeyan would achieve 3 points finishes that year, which would be good, if his teammate JP Oliveira didn't absolutely dominate the series himself. A minor setback for sure, but he would continue racing in Super Formula until 2018, having previously loathed Japan. He grew to love his time there, learned the language, and looked at sashimi the same way that Americans look at lawsuits. So how did he do in his time there? Well, in 2015, he raced with Team Dandelion, paired with Tomoki Najiri. He started off the season well with a podium, but teammate Najiri would finish higher in the standings with more points. In 2016, he switched to Team Le Mans, racing alongside Kamui Kobayashi, and this is where the tables turned. Karthikeyan scored a podium at Okayama, while Kobayashi scored nada. Thus, Karthikeyan beat Kobayashi in that year's Super Formula Championship. For the 2017 season, however, Karthikeyan felt the need to switch teams, this time to Nakajima Racing, paired with Daisuke Nakajima. Neither driver achieved much success, with Karthikeyan being particularly let down, finishing last overall in the standings. Remaining with Nakajima again for 2018, and this time paired with GP2 reject Takuya Ozawa, Karthikeyan would finish 15th overall, beating Ozawa in the standings in what would turn out to be his last year in open wheel racing. In 2019, he made his debut in the Super GT series, piloting the Nakajima Racing Honda NSX alongside Tadasuke Makino. He and Makino performed modestly throughout the year, with a best result of 2nd at Sportsland Sugo, but the highlight of the year came at Fuji at the DTM Super GT Dream Race, where Karthikeyan would take the race win ahead of Marco Wittmann and Loic Duval. But following this, Karthikeyan left the series, and his future in motor racing remains unclear. So it's been quite a journey for Karthikeyan, being India's pioneer in Formula 1, showing that it can certainly be possible. Most would look at his Formula 1 career as a failure, but honestly, when you look back on it, you have to he sucked. But the importance of his Formula 1 career to a whole nation cannot be understated. Drivers such as the Mainis and Jihan Daruvala are winning in the F1 Feeders series against some of the world's very best. And let's not forget the last Indian to win a European championship. While India's current motorsport situation is ridden with politics and other nasty stuff that kind of plagues the rest of the motor racing world, there is still some good talent coming out of that country. And for however many memes surround this cucumber, he's set the benchmark and he's provided inspiration to millions. So yeah, what were your memories of Karthikeyan? Drop a comment below, subscribe to the channel if you're awesome, and always remember, keep it respectful, be wholesome, don't be a manus, and as always, I'll see you all later.
Let me tell you, wanna see you fly, way up on my side, till the day I die, we're heading for the silver line. Let me tell you, wanna see you move, cause there's room for two, every day, every night, we turn up to 9-9.